We will be sharing a little bit about digital identity for organizations and how critical this is for trusted data ecosystems. But before I go into the details of why it is critical, I'd like to introduce you the Swiss foundation that I have the honor to be the CEO of, the Global Legal Entity Identifier Foundation, or Foundation of Life. So, legal entities, are generally incorporated at national level. So that's where they legally exist. They receive a business registry identity, like in Switzerland is the UID. It's working well within country, but as soon as you go out of the country, that identifier and the reference data associated to that identifier, sometimes can be lost due to translation. If you go to the business registry of Japan, it's all in Japanese, but also to lack of standardization. This is a realization that has taken place after the 2008 crisis, financial crisis, where when Lehman Brothers collapsed, it was not one legal entity, but hundreds of legal entities of Lehman Brothers that collapsed overnight with no standard set of reference data or identifier to rely on to do cross-entity risk management, cross-entity exposure management. And that's really when the LEI came about. So the G20, the government of the G20, decided to create a digital public good that would, public good infrastructure that would provide passport for company, an identifier that can be recognized across the world. And that's when the legal entity identifier was created. So on the left, you will see how it works. We have the Regulatory Oversight Committee, which is a group of public authorities from 50 countries around the world who are overseeing the identity system and ensure that it remains a non-for-profit public good. Very important. We have the GLIFE, Global LEI Foundation, that I'm managing, which is a small team of 70 people who are accrediting what we call LEI issuers, which are a decentralized network of entities who are accredited to verify the existence of companies and issue them a passport to their identifier, the LEI, and a set of reference data. And GLIFE is also in charge of publishing that information completely publicly for free. So if you go on the Global LEI Foundation website, you will find an index where your company actually might be registered with completely freely accessible open data information that then you can use for many things. Many things is the initial use cases of the LEI, which was in the financial industry, to do regulatory reporting, to do risk management, to do exposure management, to counterparty identification, but also in payments or cross-border payments, identification of the entities you pay, but also in trade, in supply chain management, where you need to identify your suppliers, and in a way that is universal, standardized, and clear and used by everybody within the same ecosystem. And that's what we really see in the LEI, how it has evolved in the last 10 years, because it's a 10 years old system. It started in finance, and now it slowly but surely is moving into use cases in trade, in supply chain management, even in press outlet identification, in quite a few use cases, with a very dramatic evolution in the last 2 years, which is what we call the digital identity, the verifiable legal entity identifier, which enables these companies to verifiably prove who they are on any digital platforms, the internet, blockchain, whatever system, in a way that when I'm presented by the VAI by UBS, for example, or by Nestle on a internet platform or a utility, a trade utility, I can be sure I'm talking to UBS or to Nestle. Not only I'm sure I'm talking to the entity, not someone impersonating that entity, But I'm also able to know who I'm talking to at that entity, because the verifiable legal entity identifier enables what we call delegation of authority, meaning I'm an entity and I'm authorizing this individual, a CEO, or this staff, or this system, or this machine, or this AI agent in the future to act on my behalf. And everything is traceable back to the entity, traceable back to life as a rule of trust. So it is a very strong system, digital system, that is leveraging what we call decentralized identity and verifiable credential approaches. So as I mentioned, it really enables an entity to prove who they are and to delegate authority to people, machines, system acting on behalf of that entity to prove that they are authorized to do something for that entity. And that's coming to what we're talking about. Data is quite important, because when data flow from an entity, you want to be sure that that data is coming from that entity, and it is not coming from someone impersonating that entity. Quite important. So, very important to mention, the LEI and VLEI are ISO standards, ISO 17442, so they are governed by a very strong governance framework, because for that type of system to work, you need a very strong rule of trust, which is the LEI Foundation, not-for-profit public good, overseen by the public authorities. And you need a very strong governance framework to ensure that nobody can fake the system and create fake VLEI or fake LEIs. So that's the introduction. I wanted to give now back the floor to Vasily, who is a lot more aware of how it works under the hood, and he's going to explain you how that system I just explained functionally and governance at governance level works under the hood.
Yeah, thank you, Alexandre. Yeah, so this is my favorite topic. I actually, spend a lot of time going very, very deep into technologies to understand how they work, but not just to amuse myself, but to actually reason about the business use, right? What can technologies guarantee? What kind of use cases they can enable? And I'll just spend a little bit of time on this technology because it's a relatively new technology called Carry ACDC. A bit of an interesting name. So Carry stands for Key Event Receipt Infrastructure. ACDC is not for the music group. It's authentic chain data containers. And this is, very important sort of takeaway about that, right? So, what are we talking about? We're talking about actually a foundational layer, how the companies across the globe can identify themselves, right? And then create the whole network of different roles. And of course, in companies, there's all kinds of different roles, official roles such as CEO, but lots and lots of unofficial roles that are very job specific and very industry specific. How can it all scale, right? How can it all scale? And another interesting thing, so once we have that base credentials, what can we do on top of that, right? And basically, that's what this technology enables. I will not spend a lot of time to talk about, the security, the key management and stuff like that. I'll just talk about the data and how data is handled here. So, on the left, you basically see some, some attributes of the data container that's being used to transport those credentials about the company, about the role, and other different things. And we also see that basically it's errors, right? And what these errors are is basically that's where the chaining comes from. The idea is that when we present two credentials, for example, right? So I present my EID credential and I present my educational credential. How do you link these two together? How do you know they actually belong to the same person? Do you compare the names? Is that enough? Maybe, right? But when we talk about more complex data, we actually want to unequivocally, make sure, especially when we talk about supply chains or healthcare data and so on and so forth, right? When one data belongs to another data set, another data set consumes other different types of data, we want to link those and make them verifiable and composable such that we avoid this, this problem of understanding which data belongs to which data, right? And it's all based on this global framework where we know which companies we're dealing with, it's been verified, right? And then we can start creating other credentials because this technology allows these companies then to create their own industry-specific credentials and link them together to create, almost like a data mesh, basically a graph that can be navigated, validated, and verified, and prove that it's all there, right? So that's a very important part about this technology. So now you might be wondering, okay, so what does it have to do with data spaces? So let me basically talk about that. I think previous sessions were actually really, really good, because if we look at, and I try to zoom out a little bit and talk about generically what data spaces are, right? So when we talk about the core, data space core, if it's central or decentral, it's mostly about, okay, how do I get the data? What type of data get? The type of schemas I need. How do I govern the data, get the access? How do I facilitate data exchange and storage and so on and so forth, right? But that we know, right? We know how that functions. And we have multiple things that need to probably interoperate, right? Where it becomes actually interesting is when we start thinking about different applications and that being enabled by data suppliers, data consumers, providers, and all kinds of people that participate into data space, right? And when we consider that, a lot of applications we've seen today, they actually mix the identity from individuals with the identity of the companies, right? Which is actually very, very interesting, because once you talk about that, not just for the companies, but also for individuals, now you need to say, okay, how do I trust the data? Where is the data coming from? So Alexandre talked about that a little bit, right? It's provenance. What about ownership? So some wonderful presentation from Panzer. He says, we're willing to maybe share the data, but we want to understand the playing rules. And maybe it's not just Bobby, right? They want to share the data with maybe some other data spaces, right? Because we have multiple data spaces that are actually use case specific, right? Because we want to solve a certain problem. We need different participants exchanging the data. So we need to talk about ownership, usage rights, compliance, opt-in, opt-out, all kinds of different things that actually enable this application. Because if I'm not sure about the data, if I don't know how to use the data, I'm not likely to invest in an application of using the data, right? So it's a very, very important thing. How do we solve that? So basically, with that in mind, since we're talking about the companies and individuals, and it's always very, very important interplay, let us maybe talk a little bit about information privacy and ownership. So in fact, we're all familiar with GDPR, and I think it's a great thing. Unfortunately, we mostly see it through cookies, which are actually very, very annoying, and you open up the setting and say, 800 partners and us care about your privacy, so please go through like 5 pages and understand what we're going to do with your data. And in fact, but the idea is good, and it's actually not a new idea. So sometimes it's important to understand where things are coming from. And basically, how we deal with the data is called Fair Information Processing Practices, or FIPS for short. And it actually started in the 70s in Germany, where they took and Hugh also in the United States, where they looked at unions and how to process the data. So, okay, how do we deal with the data? How do we store it? Who has the rights? Then, of course, in the 80s, there was additional work through OECD and the European Council. Then it went in the 90s to the UN guidelines, with the Data Protection Directive, and finally in 2016, we have the GDPR that we all like, right? So, we don't enjoy. And generally speaking, what it's all about. Actually, it's a very, very nice paper if you really want to read a lot about this history and how this works, by Michael Bernhardt, which called Defense and Privacy is Control, Properly Understood. So what is privacy is control? Often privacy is control. Those are the cookies, right? That we see. It's just one manifestation of it. It's often reduced to notice and consent, don't consent, right? In the US, it's opt out. In Europe, it's opt in, but it's the same thing, right? But that was actually never the intent. In fact, when we talk about the data, and it's also relevant for the companies as well when they exchange the data, it's about data meeting points. Right? We talk about the whole life cycle of data, because just collecting the data, like cookies and stuff, right? That's just the first step. I want to know what's happening with this data is being processed, right? I want to understand what data is being used. I want to actually take action when the data is being transferred or when the data is deleted. When we talk about healthcare data, for example, mobility data and so on and so forth, like many of us drive vehicles, right? When you turn on your telematics system, it gives you like a long list of things you actually agree or don't agree on. It's a binary choice. And once you've done it, you don't know what's happening with the data. Do you agree with it? Do you not agree with it? Do you want to, actually remove the consent and access to the data? This is what this is all about, right? This is what needs to be enabled for our wonderful world of data spaces that enable efficiency data processes to actually happen, right? So let's take a look how that's possible. Actually, let us consider a very small sort of ecosystem where we have some individual that might delegate somebody, especially for health data, that's very, very relevant, for example, right? And we have some sort of organization which is a data source, working with a supplier that does something with their data, provides services to them. Then we have another organization that is using the service, right? And they work together with the usual sort of issuer, verifier, consumer, producer type of thing, right? So the next thing is, okay, how do we enable the, a certainty about the data ownership, what can be done with it, can be not done with it, well, you did exchange agreement. So it's actually very, very nice work financed by European Union. If you go to ddagrant.io, they created a whole specification of machine-readable, machine-executable, and human-executable kind of regarding type of contract specification for data disclosure agreement. And you can automate a lot of things there. Well, great, but how do I know who's who, right? Well, we solved the problem with VLEI. And why do we need VLEI? We know that some data spaces can just put the service together and just onboard people. Well, you're wasting a lot of time, especially if you go internationally, that's difficult scalable. When everyone has to solve the same problem, it's actually expensive. Why not use what's available today? What's scalable that solves a lot of this problem? So that's basically the VLEI technology system. And then, of course, with individuals, right? So with individuals, you come into PID, and then you enable that interoperability. You say, okay, great, an individual, I know who they are. That's a great use case. They can sign, the data agreement. We know what it is. We can automatically process this. We can relate it to the companies and track the data throughout the whole ecosystem. And all of a sudden, right, we have a very scalable platform that can, onboard international, local people, and solve all kinds of different things. Now, what I wanted to maybe quickly finish, is because we're running out of time, is, there's a lot of prior work out there. Let's not reinvent the wheel. Let's use what's available today and actually focus on important business things. But, it's important not to experiment just for the sake of experimenting, because if you're not familiar with XKCD, it's about a guy that says, well, you know what, because I can, I have a glass of water. I'm just going to put vacuum at the bottom, below the water. And the girl says, uh-oh, women are very smart. Because what happens is the thing just blows up, right? So let's not blow this up and use the things that actually solve our problems. Thank you.